Spoiler alert, this is part 2 of a two-parter. If you haven't already watched part 1, you should probably do that now. Press the button up there in the corner or whatever. It's the 12th of June 1871. Well, obviously it isn't right now because, you know, traffic and that, but just imagine, yeah, 4-year-old Sydney Albert Barker is holidaying in a lodging house in Brighton with his parents and 2 uncles. One of those uncles, Charles Miller, that morning buys some chocolates from Maynard's of West Street to share with the boy. The duo eats several chocolates that morning, presumably unadulterated ones, with no ill effect. But in the afternoon, Charles offers Sydney a single chocolate. The boy wolfs it down and says it tastes well rank, or whatever the Victorian equivalent of that phrase is. Within 10 minutes, the child is having convulsions. Within half an hour, he is dead, the tragic victim of strychnine poisoning. His uncle, having had several more chocolates himself, will be ill for several days. Brighton had built its reputation as a tourist town on its perceived health-giving properties. Sea bathing, or indeed merely taking the sea air, is prescribed as a tonic for those of all social classes. Yet for young Londoners Sydney, Brighton had brought not health, but death. As the national newspapers start going big on the story and tourist numbers begin to slump, local police inspector William Gibbs sets out to track down and catch the chocolate cream killer. Roll titles. In many ways, Christiana Edmonds made herself easy to catch by hiding in plain sight. Heck, she even appeared at the dead boy's inquest, taking to the stand to claim that she too had bought and eaten poisoned chocolates from Maynard's. At that time, Chrissy was one of only 3 known people to have been poisoned by the shop, along with Sydney and his uncle. After the inquest, she sent Sydney's dad anonymous letters urging him to pursue the case. She was trying to frame Mr. Maynard the chocolatier and Mr. Ware, whose London factory had made the chocolates. In the end, the inquest recorded a verdict of accidental poisoning, though there was no explanation for how the strychnine had actually got into the chocolates. Heck, it's the Victorian era, some food just got poison in it. Perhaps surprisingly, the young boy's death didn't bring an end to Chrissy's poisoning campaign. If anything, she ratcheted it up a gear, but with one important change. Despite the fact she'd left bags around town with "for the children" written on them, her main target was adults, particularly the wife of her crush, Dr. Beard. Because of the bitter taste of strychnine, adults weren't eating a fatal dose. Sydney only died because he was tiny. So Christiana switched to the equally deadly, but far less detectable, arsenic. But where did she get that from? Nobody really knows. She did send another forged note from Glazer and Kemp to Garrett. "Hello again, mate. We've only gone and run out of arsenic now too. Can we borrow a load off you?" Despite his previously lax attitude, heck, he'd even sent Edmonds' poison book when she faked a note from the coroner. On this occasion, Garrett actually checked with Glazer and Kemp. "We don't know what you're talking about, mate. We never asked to borrow nothing off you," they said to him, though perhaps not in that accent. Remarkably, Isaac Garrett had actually saved all of these forged notes. Britain's first, and at that time only, handwriting expert, Frederick Netherclift, would match them to Christiana at a subsequent murder trial. With plenty of people, including Mrs. Beard and multiple errand boys, identifying Christiana as the poisoner, Inspector Gibbs made his arrest. She was put on trial at the Old Bailey. It was felt that local anger wouldn't make a fair hearing in Sussex possible. The parade of witnesses and expert testimony meant a guilty verdict was almost inevitable. Chrissy's lawyers argued a case for hereditary insanity, but the jury found her guilty of murder. Edmonds was sentenced to death. Cue reconstruction. Remarkably, we didn't make any of that up. A police officer sent out to buy a stethoscope for a pregnancy examination did indeed return with a telescope. When an actual stethoscope had been sourced, Christiana, a 43-year-old woman with no known sexual relationships, was perhaps unsurprisingly declared unpregnant. As Edmonds sat waiting her execution in Lewes Jail, the public mood started to turn towards thinking that maybe she was a bit insane after all. That whole thinking she was up the duff thing was a factor in this, along with the fact that Victorians thought all women were sweet, fluffy little things that couldn't possibly want to do deliberate harm to anybody. Even well-respected medical journal The Lancet had an editorial claiming that Edmonds had been driven insane by her celibacy. A petition to revoke her death penalty was signed by several of her victims, including Isaac Garrett. The trial judge, Baron Martin, had many misgivings of his own. Once press interest in the case had died down, the verdict against Edmonds was quietly changed. She would live out the remaining 35 years of her life in Broadmoor Asylum, where she died on the 19th of September 1907 at the then ripe old age of 78. Coincidentally, Chrissy's brother would also die in an asylum, the one on Robben Island off Cape Town, that would later be a prison holding, amongst others, Nelson Mandela. But William Edmonds wasn't an inmate, he was the governor. Meanwhile, the object of Chrissy's affections, Dr. Charles Beard, would in later life be declared insane himself, dying at Holloway Sanatorium in Surrey in 1916. There was a somewhat happier ending for Albert Barker, the father of Christiana's 4-year-old victim. He would go on to become one of Britain's top silversmiths. Today, his work is much sought after at auction and features in the Victoria and Albert Museum. If the tragic tale of Christiana Edmonds has a moral for the modern age, then it's probably much better than the one we could come up with, which is simply this: don't eat bitter chocolate, no matter how steampunk you think you are. Forget the pavilion. Next week on Fact Me Up, we look at some of Brighton's other weird and wonderful architectural oddities.